Welcome to our deep dive on childhood trauma. You guys provided some really incredible sources, videos, a TED Talk, even some pretty hard-hitting statistics.
Yeah.
So we're going to unpack it all, like how those adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs, those can really have a lasting impact on someone's health and their behavior and their outlook on life.
It's really fascinating, like how much we're actually learning about how common childhood trauma is.
Right.
One of the sources, therapy, in a nutshell, they said that a huge 64% of adults have at least one ACE.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's like almost 2 out of 3 people.
Right.
It really makes you think about the people you interact with every day, your family, your friends, your colleagues. It's likely that a lot of them have experienced some form of trauma in their childhood.
Exactly. And it really challenges this idea that trauma only happens to other people.
Right.
Yeah. And it reminds us that these experiences are way more common and they can have ripple effects far beyond just the individual.
Okay, so let's get into what actually qualifies as trauma, because I think there's this misconception that it has to be this massive event.
Right.
But our sources suggest that's not really the case.
Yeah, a lot of the sources actually, like Doc Snipes and those experts from IHGCYCI talks, they emphasize that trauma isn't just physical or sexual abuse, although those are definitely traumatic.
Yeah.
But it also includes things like neglect or witnessing violence, even things like parental mental health struggles or moving around a lot.
Moving around a lot, really?
Yeah, think about it from a kid's perspective, constantly uprooting their life, leaving their friends' schools, familiar surroundings. That can create a really big sense of instability and insecurity, to disrupt their attachments that are so important for development.
That's a really good point. It really shows how trauma is more about the impact on the child, not just the event itself.
Right.
So listeners, it might be helpful to think back to your own childhood. Were there any experiences that felt unsafe or overwhelming or just confusing, experiences that maybe didn't fit the classic definition of trauma, but still had a big impact?
Yeah, it's a good question to think about because even those seemingly small experiences can have a big impact on how our brains develop, especially when we're young and our neural pathways are still forming.
Speaking of the brain, one of the sources, Anna Freud, she explained beautifully how those early experiences, especially those involving caregivers, they literally mold the developing brain.
Yeah, it's like those early relationships are creating the blueprint for how we interact with the world. How we regulate our emotions, how we form attachments later in life.
Right.
And those early experiences were traumatic. That can lead to a sense of hypervigilance, your brain is always on alert, constantly scanning for danger.
Like Doc Snipes described it, the brain becomes a survival machine, not a broken one. It's like a kid's brain is on high alert all the time, like a smoke alarm going off even when there's no fire.
Exactly. And that state of always being on alert can really take a toll on the developing brain.
Yeah.
Especially in areas like the amygdala, which processes fear and anxiety, and the hippocampus, which is so important for memory and learning.
So even if a kid seems like they're coping on the surface, those traumatic experiences are having a massive impact on their brain development.
Right.
Potentially leading to problems with emotional regulation, impulse control, even memory and concentration.
And it's not just limited to the brain.
Oh, wow.
The TED Talk about Martha Londigan, she really brought this to life. She shared her own struggles with chronic health problems later in life and connected those back to instability and trauma in her childhood.
Yeah, her story is a powerful example of how those early experiences can leave these invisible scars, not just on our minds, but on our bodies.
Right.
She mentioned moving 14 times before the age of 12. Can you imagine that constant upheaval, never feeling stable or like you belong?
And all that stress, feeling of never being safe or secure, it can really impact the body's stress response system, particularly the HPA axis.
Okay, break that down for us. What exactly is the HPA axis and how does trauma mess with it?
Okay, imagine your body's stress response system is like this fine-tuned alarm system. The HPA axis is like the control panel. It releases hormones like cortisol and adrenaline to help you deal with threats. But when you have chronic stress, like with childhood trauma, that alarm system gets stuck in the on position.
Wow.
Yeah, and that leads to a cascade of physical and emotional consequences.
So it's like your body is always on high alert even when there's no real danger.
Right.
And that chronic stress can show up in a bunch of different ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Several sources, Therapy in a Nutshell, and Martha Londigan's TED Talk, they all highlighted the link between childhood trauma and all kinds of health issues like heart disease, autoimmune conditions, diabetes, obesity, even a higher risk of cancer.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, those early experiences are making you more vulnerable to all these health problems later on in life. And it's not just physical health. Psych2Go really got into how childhood trauma can actually like warp your whole worldview.
Yeah.
Like it can make you more pessimistic, make you feel isolated, and even lead to self-sabotage in relationships.
It's like you start to see the world and everyone in it through this distorted lens. You know, maybe you always expect the worst or struggle to trust others.
Right.
Or maybe you find yourself repeating those same unhealthy relationship patterns.
So listeners, maybe ask yourself, do you find yourself always expecting the worst? Do you have trouble trusting people even if they haven't given you a reason not to?
It's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
These could be signs that those early experiences are still affecting you today.
And that's where the potential for healing comes in, right?
But therapy support groups,
Yeah.
even just having a trusted friend to talk to. These connections can offer the safety and support you need to unpack those experiences.
Yeah.
You know, challenge those distortions and build healthier patterns.
So it's not about pretending those experiences didn't happen or minimizing their impact. It's about understanding how they might be shaping our thoughts, our feelings, or behaviors right now.
Right.
And with that awareness, we can make different choices, create healthier boundaries, build better relationships.
It's about realizing that you're not defined by your past, but you can choose how you relate to it. You can let it control you, or you can use it as a source of strength, resilience, even growth.
And speaking of growth, let's switch gears a little bit and get into Martha Londigen's TEDx talk. She was so open about her childhood, which was marked by instability and crime, and even her mother's incarceration.
Yeah, her honesty and vulnerability were incredible.
Right.
She didn't shy away from the hard details, you know, sharing those specific experiences that really bring the impact of ACEs to life.
Remember that stat about moving 14 times before age 12? That was Martha's life. She talked about being a Fayetteville street rat kid, dealing with the shame of being the druggy, hippie convicts kid.
Right.
These aren't just abstract ideas. These are real-life experiences that shaped her in profound ways.
And what's so powerful is that despite all the hardship, it's a story of resilience and hope.
Yeah.
She doesn't see herself as a victim, but as a survivor.
Right.
Someone who's taken those experiences and turned them into a source of strength and purpose.
There's this one moment in her talk where she realizes that living in spite of her past was actually keeping her stuck. It was like she was always trying to prove something, but it just kept her tied to that pain.
That's such a huge insight.
Yeah.
Doc Snipes talked about how important it is to process trauma, not just try to push past it.
Yeah.
He even suggested we need to deal with not just the big traumas, but also the secondary losses that come from them.
So listeners, maybe ask yourselves, are you living in spite of your past? Are you always trying to prove yourself, overachieve, avoid anything that might trigger those old wounds? What would it look like to actually integrate those experiences into your present? To acknowledge their impact without letting them define you?
It's a tough journey, but it can be incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
It's about realizing that those experiences are part of who you are, but they don't have to be your whole story. You can rewrite the narrative, find meaning and purpose in those experiences, even use them to help others who've been through something similar.
And that's exactly what Martha Londigen has done. She's taken her pain and turned it into empathy and connection.
Right.
She works with people impacted by incarceration, especially kids. It's like she's saying, I see you, I understand, you're not alone.
Her story is a powerful testament to just how much humans can heal, grow, and find meaning even in the darkest places.
That's a message we could all use a little more of, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a reminder that while childhood trauma is a big problem and it has lasting effects, it's not a life sentence.
Right.
Understanding the science, seeking support, building resilience, those are the things that can lead to healing and even post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how much her story resonates with people. She's such a great example of how our stories can connect us, inspire us, and remind us that we're not alone in our struggles.
You know what really struck me about her TED Talk? It wasn't just about her experiences. It was also about like the healing power of connecting with other people. She talked about finding comfort in sharing her story and connecting with others who understood what she'd been through.
Yeah, that's something that comes up in a lot of our sources, actually. Like therapy, in a nutshell, they emphasized how important social support is as a buffer against the negative effects of trauma.
Right.
Like having a strong network of supportive relationships can actually help reduce the impact of those early experiences.
It makes you think about the power of community, right? Like having people you can lean on, you know, people you can be vulnerable with who make you feel like you belong and like they get you. Exactly. And it's not just about receiving support. It's also about giving it Remember how Martha found purpose in working with people impacted by incarceration?
Yeah.
It's like she took her pain and turned it into empathy and action,
Right.
reaching out to others who've walked a similar path.
That's such a great example of post-traumatic growth. It's like those experiences, even the painful ones, they can be a catalyst for positive change, both in our own lives and in the world around us. It's about finding that silver lining, that sense of purpose that comes out of the darkness.
And it's also about realizing that healing isn't just an individual thing, it's a collective thing. We can all play a part in creating a world that's more trauma-informed.
Right.
A world where people feel safe and supported and empowered to share their stories and seek help when they need it.
So it's not just about addressing our own individual experiences, but about creating a culture of compassion and understanding,
Right.
where trauma is acknowledged and validated and met with support instead of stigma.
Yeah, it's about shifting from a reactive approach where we're always trying to fix problems after they happen to a proactive approach where we create environments and systems that support people's well-being right from the start.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, but I also want to bring it back to our listener. Those who might be listening and thinking, okay, I get it. Childhood trauma is a big deal. It has all these long-term effects, but what can I actually do about it?
That's a great question. And Doc Snipes addresses that directly in his video. He talks about the importance of developing skills to regulate your nervous system and manage those stress responses that are often triggered by trauma.
So it's not just about talking about our feelings. It's about giving ourselves practical tools and strategies to navigate those tough moments.
Right.
When those old wounds resurface and threaten to overwhelm us.
Exactly. He talks about mindfulness, distress tolerance, even identifying your personal vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Those things that can trigger impulsive behaviors. It's about empowering yourself with the knowledge and tools to interrupt those automatic reactions. The patterns that might have worked in the past but aren't helpful now.
It's like hitting the pause button, right? Instead of just reacting impulsively based on those old survival instincts, we can take a second to assess the situation, connect with our breath, remind ourselves that we're safe now, and then choose a more mindful response.
That's a perfect analogy. It's about taking back control from those ingrained patterns that don't serve us anymore. And it takes practice. It's not like you just flip a switch and those impulsive reactions are gone, but with awareness, intention, and support, you can rewire those neural pathways and choose a different way of being.
And that reminds me of something else. Doc Snipes mentioned the importance of defining what he calls a rich and meaningful life. It's like having a vision, a sense of purpose that can guide your choices and keep you motivated, even when those old patterns try to pull you back.
It's about shifting from just surviving to actually thriving. Creating a life that aligns with your values, your passions, and your aspirations. It's about realizing that you deserve to be happy, that you deserve to feel fulfilled, and that you can create a life that reflects that.
That's a message I think we all need to hear more often. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, the stress, the challenges of life.
Right.
But it's so important to remind ourselves that we have the power to create a life that's meaningful and joyful. A life that's worth living even when things are hard.
It's about choosing hope, choosing healing, choosing to believe that we're worthy of a life filled with love, connection, and purpose.
Yeah.
And recognizing that those choices, those small acts of self-care and self-love, they can create a ripple effect that spreads out to our families, our communities, even the world around us.
Speaking of choices, I want to bring up something that Psych2Go talked about that got me thinking. The idea that some of the things we think of as ADHD symptoms might actually be caused by trauma. They pointed out that a kid who's fidgety, impulsive, or has trouble focusing might actually be struggling with the effects of trauma, not a neurological disorder.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and one that's getting more attention in the mental health field.
All right.
It highlights how important it is to look beyond the surface and consider the root causes of behavior.
It's like we're so quick to label and categorize.
Yeah.
But sometimes those labels can hide the real story.
Yeah.
And misdiagnosis can have serious consequences, like a kid who gets mislabeled with ADHD might be given medication that doesn't address the real problem.
Right.
And they might miss out on the therapy they need to process and heal from their experiences.
Exactly. It's not that ADHD doesn't exist, but we need to recognize that trauma can look like those symptoms. And it's crucial to consider the child's whole history before slapping on a label.
So we need to ask the right questions, dig deeper, and take a more holistic approach to understanding and addressing kids' mental and behavioral health.
And that requires a shift in thinking from mental health professionals and from society as a whole. We need to move beyond those simple labels and really grasp the nuances of human behavior.
Yeah.
We need to understand that our experiences, especially those early childhood experiences, shape who we are. And those experiences can show up in a lot of different ways, both physically and mentally.
So what does this mean for our listeners? Maybe it's about questioning those assumptions, the labels that might have been put on them or others. Maybe it's about advocating for a more holistic approach to mental health care, an approach that takes into account the whole range of experiences and influences.
Exactly. It's about being curious, being open-minded, and being willing to challenge the status quo when it comes to mental health.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that healing is not a straight line.
Yeah.
And it often takes a multifaceted approach, one that addresses both the symptoms and the underlying causes.
And that brings us to another key concept that came up in several sources, the importance of trauma processing.
Right.
Doc Snipes emphasized that we need to address not just the big traumatic events, but also the secondary losses that come from them.
That's a really important distinction. It's not just about dealing with the initial trauma. It's about recognizing all the effects. The ways those experiences impact our relationships, our opportunities, our sense of self, even how we see the world.
He even said that those secondary losses can sometimes hit harder than the original trauma itself.
Wow.
It's like the initial event sets off a chain reaction, leading to a whole bunch of losses and challenges that can feel impossible to deal with.
Like that those losses pile up over time,
right,
creating this sense of grief and disorientation that can be really hard to navigate.
Yeah.
It might be the loss of trust, the loss of innocence, the loss of feeling safe and secure in the world. And those losses can impact everything. Our relationships, our career choices, our self-esteem, even our physical health.
So how do we even begin to process all of that? It can feel so overwhelming.
That's where professional support is so important. Working with a therapist or counselor who specializes in trauma can give you a safe place to explore those experiences. Process those emotions and develop healthier coping strategies.
It's not about dwelling on the past or getting stuck in those painful memories.
Right.
It's about creating a narrative that includes those experiences without letting them define us.
It's about finding that balance.
Right.
Acknowledging the pain without letting it take over, and recognizing the strength and resilience that came from those experiences.
It's about honoring our past without letting it control our future.
Exactly. And therapy can give you the tools and support to navigate that journey. It can help you identify those negative thought patterns, the ones that keep you stuck in fear and self-doubt. It can help you regulate your emotions, develop healthier ways of coping, and build stronger, more fulfilling relationships.
Doc Snipes also talked about developing a secure attachment to our inner child, which I thought was really interesting.
That's a beautiful concept, and it relates to the idea of reparenting ourselves.
Yeah.
Recognizing that part of us that experienced the trauma.
Yeah.
That young, vulnerable version of ourselves that might still be carrying those wounds.
It's like we're giving that inner child the compassion, understanding, and security that they might not have gotten when they were young.
Right.
It's about acknowledging their pain, validating their experiences, and letting them know that they're safe now.
It's a really powerful way to approach healing, to offer ourselves that same love and care that we would give to a hurting child. It's about realizing that we're not defined by our past, but that we can choose to have a more loving and compassionate relationship with ourselves both now and in the future.
I love that it's such a gentle and nurturing way to think about healing, and it reminds us that we all have that inner child inside, that part of us that just wants to feel safe, loved, and accepted.
And that's a message that I think really speaks to people, especially those who've been through trauma. It's about understanding that those wounds might still be there, but they don't have to define us. We can choose to heal, to grow, and to create a life that's more loving and fulfilling.
As we're talking about healing and growth, I'm also thinking about how trauma affects the brain. Something that a lot of our sources brought up,
Right.
IHDCYH Talks and the Anna Freud source, both highlighted how early adversity can literally change the structure and function of the brain.
Yeah.
Especially in those areas that control emotional regulation, stress response, and even memory.
That's where the science gets really fascinating and really sad. It's about understanding that those early experiences, especially ones that involve chronic stress or neglect, can have a huge impact on the developing brain.
Right.
They literally shape the neural pathways that control how we think, feel, and behave.
The IHDCYH Talks source used this analogy of a tree. They explained how a young sapling that's exposed to harsh winds or bad soil might grow up crooked or stunted. It's the same with the brain. Those early experiences create the conditions for how the brain develops, and those conditions can either help it grow healthy or make it vulnerable for life.
And the Anna Freud source talked about how those early experiences, especially trauma, can create a state of hypervigilance,
Right.
where the brain is always on guard looking out for danger, even when there's no real threat.
It's like that fight or flight response is stuck in the on position,
Yeah.
leading to constant stress, anxiety, and even physical health problems.
And what's even scarier is that those changes in brain structure and function can make it harder to learn to control emotions, to build healthy relationships, and to deal with stress later in life.
It's like a vicious cycle, and it shows how important early intervention is.
Right.
Creating supportive environments for kids and addressing those traumatic experiences as soon as possible to minimize the long-term damage. So it's not just about addressing the symptoms, it's about creating the right conditions for healthy brain development.
Right.
You know, for fostering resilience and for giving kids the support and resources they need to thrive.
It's about recognizing that those early experiences have a massive impact on the developing brain and doing everything we can to create environments that nurture those young minds and help them grow up healthy.
And as we're talking about the brain, I'm also thinking about the specific parts of the brain that are often affected by trauma. Several sources like Therapy in a Nutshell, IHDCYH Talks, and the Anna Freud source all pointed to the amygdala,
Right.
which is often called the brain's fear center. They talked about how trauma can make the amygdala more sensitive to perceived threats,
Yeah.
which can lead to more anxiety and fear.
Like the amygdala gets stuck in overdrive,
Yeah.
constantly looking for danger and triggering those fight or flight responses, even situations that wouldn't normally cause that kind of reaction.
Right.
And that can cause a ton of problems. Anxiety, panic attacks, phobias, even trouble sleeping or concentrating.
It's like your brain is always in survival mode, even when there's no real danger around. And that can be so exhausting and debilitating.
Right. Makes it hard to enjoy life, to be in relationships, even just to function day to day.
And what's even more worrisome is that those changes in the amygdala can make it harder to learn from experience, to control emotions, and to form healthy attachments.
Right.
It's like the brain is wired for fear and distrust, which makes it hard to feel safe and secure in the world.
So it's not just about feeling anxious or fearful.
Right.
It's about those deeper changes in the brain that can impact how we see the world, how we interact with others, even how we experience ourselves.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the neuroscience of trauma.
Yeah.
To recognize that those changes in the brain aren't a weakness or a personal failure, but a normal response to overwhelming stress and adversity.
And it's about getting the right kind of support and interventions to help rewire those neural pathways.
Right.
To calm that overactive amygdala and to restore a sense of balance and safety in the brain. It's about recognizing that healing is possible, that the brain is amazingly adaptable, and that with the right support, we can retrain our brains to feel safe, secure, and connected to the world around us.
You know, I don't want to get too deep into the science, but I do think it's helpful to understand how those early experiences, especially trauma, can physically shape the brain.
Right.
It's not about blaming ourselves or feeling hopeless. It's about recognizing how powerful those experiences were and finding the support and tools we need to rewire those neural pathways and create a more balanced and resilient brain.
Absolutely. And the cool thing is that science is always moving forward. And we're learning more and more about the brain's ability to change, even in adulthood. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself is a powerful force and offers hope that even people who experience a lot of trauma can heal and create new, healthier patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving.
So it's not about being defined by our past, by those early experiences that might have shaped our brains in certain ways. It's about recognizing that our brains are constantly changing, adapting and evolving, and that we have the power to influence that process through our choices, our actions, and the support we seek out.
It's about embracing neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
Recognizing that our brains aren't fixed, but are flexible and capable of healing and growing throughout our lives.
Right.
And I think that's a really empowering message.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even though trauma can have a huge impact on the brain, it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Right.
We have the ability to heal, to grow, and to create new neural pathways that support our well-being.
And that healing journey often involves understanding and addressing how trauma affects other specific parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, which is super important for memory and learning.
Right. Therapy in a Nutshell and the Anna Freud source both talked about how trauma can mess with the hippocampus, leading to problems with memory concentration, and even the ability to process and integrate new information.
It's like the hippocampus gets overloaded, bombarded with those stress hormones, and it starts to malfunction.
Wow.
Memories might become fragmented or distorted. It can be tough to recall details or form new memories. And even the ability to learn from experience can be impaired.
And that can really affect a child's development.
Right.
Their ability to do well in school, to build relationships, even to develop a sense of self.
Yeah, it's like they're always struggling to keep up, to make sense of the world, and to feel in control.
And what's even sadder is that those difficulties with memory and learning can be mistaken for laziness, defiance, or even a lack of intelligence.
Right, but it's actually the brain's way of trying to protect itself. To cope with all that overwhelming stress and fear that trauma brings.
It's like those survival mechanisms that were so important during those traumatic experiences are now working against them.
Yeah.
Creating challenges in their everyday lives.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that those struggles aren't a sign of the child's character or potential, but a symptom of how trauma has affected their developing brain.
So instead of labeling them as lazy or difficult,
Right.
we need to see those struggles through a trauma-informed lens, understanding that they're a natural result of what their brains have been through.
And that change in perspective can make a huge difference.
Right.
It can lead to more compassion, more patience, and more effective interventions that target the underlying trauma instead of just managing the symptoms.
And, as we're talking about those interventions, I'm also thinking about the prefrontal cortex, that executive center of the brain. The part that's responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation.
Right. Therapy in a Nutshell and the Anna Freud source both talk about how trauma can disrupt the development and function of the prefrontal cortex, making it harder to think clearly, make good decisions, control impulses, and regulate emotions.
It's like the prefrontal cortex gets hijacked by the amygdala, that fear center that's always on high alert after trauma.
Yeah.
And that can lead to a whole bunch of problems, trouble focusing, making decisions, controlling anger, or impulsivity, even forming healthy attachments.
It's like the rational thinking part of the brain gets overridden by those basic survival instincts,
Right.
making it hard to react to situations in a calm, thoughtful, and appropriate way. And that can cause all sorts of issues, conflicts in relationships, trouble doing well in school or work, even engaging in risky or self-destructive behaviors.
It's like those survival mechanisms that were so important during those early traumatic experiences are now causing problems in their everyday lives,
Right.
making it hard to handle the complexities of the world and to build healthy and fulfilling relationships.
Exactly. And it's even more concerning that those struggles with executive function can be seen as defiance, laziness, or even a lack of intelligence.
Right, but in reality, it's the brain's way of protecting itself.
Yeah.
Trying to deal with that overwhelming stress and fear that comes with trauma.
So it's not about blaming the person, but about understanding how those experiences have affected their brain development and giving them the right support and interventions to help them heal and develop those essential executive functions.
It's about recognizing that those struggles aren't a sign of the child's character or potential, but a symptom of how trauma has affected their developing brain. And it's about giving them the right support, understanding, and interventions to help them heal, to strengthen those neural pathways, and to develop those executive functions that are so crucial for success in life.
And that support might involve therapy, medication, educational help, or even just creating a more structured and supportive environment that helps reduce stress and makes them feel safe and secure.
Exactly. It's about understanding that healing is a complex process, and it often requires a team approach, involving parents, teachers, therapists, and other professionals who can work together to support the child's well-being. And, as we're talking about the impact of trauma on the brain, I'm also thinking about epigenetics. It's a concept that IHDCOH talks highlighted. They talked about how our experiences, especially trauma, can actually change the way our genes are expressed without changing the DNA sequence itself.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating and pretty new area of research that's changing how we think about the impact of trauma. Not just in the short term, but for generations.
They use this computer analogy.
Oh, yeah.
Our genes are like the hardware, the basic building blocks of who we are.
Okay.
But our experiences, especially trauma, can be like the software, influencing how that hardware works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not about changing the genes themselves, but about changing how those genes are expressed, how they work, and how they influence our physical and mental health. And those epigenetic changes can be passed down to our kids and grandkids potentially influencing their risk for certain diseases or even their temperament and personality traits.
It's like our experiences can have a lasting impact that goes beyond our own lifetimes, shaping the health and well-being of future generations.
Right.
And that's both amazing and kind of scary, isn't it?
It highlights how powerful our experiences are.
Yeah.
The importance of creating supportive environments for kids.
Yeah.
And the potential to break those cycles of trauma and adversity that can get passed down through families.
It's about understanding that our choices matter not just for ourselves, but for our kids and for future generations. It's about creating a world where all kids have the chance to thrive, to reach their full potential, and to live healthy, happy, and fulfilling lives.
It's about realizing that we're all connected. That our actions have ripple effects that go way beyond ourselves. And that by healing ourselves, we're also helping to heal the world.
That's a beautiful thought. And it brings us back to the core of this deep dive, the understanding that while trauma can have a huge impact on individuals, families, and even society as a whole, it's not the end of the story.
Right. There's always hope, always the potential for healing, and always the possibility of creating a brighter future both for ourselves and for the generations that come after us.
As we're talking about healing and creating a brighter future, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some specific examples of how childhood trauma can show up in adulthood. We've already touched on some of the mental and physical health consequences.
Yeah.
But Psych2Go really dug into those behavioral patterns and distorted perceptions that can come from those early experiences.
Right. They talked about how trauma can make you more pessimistic, make you expect the worst and have trouble trusting people. It's like those early experiences create this filter through which we see the world. And that filter is often colored by fear, distrust, in a sense that something bad is about to happen.
It's like those old wounds are still controlling our behavior, even if we're not consciously aware of it. We might find ourselves constantly on edge, withdrawing from social situations or messing up relationships before they have a chance to hurt us.
And those patterns can be so subtle, so ingrained, that we might not even realize they're coming from our past experiences.
Right.
We might just think this is just who I am, or this is how the world is, without realizing that those beliefs are rooted in those old wounds.
It's like those early experiences create these unconscious scripts that we're always playing out in our lives without even noticing.
Exactly. And it's about becoming aware of those scripts.
Yeah.
Questioning those beliefs and recognizing that we have the power to rewrite them, to create new stories that are more in line with what we value and what we want.
Psych2Go also talked about how trauma can lead to a sense of isolation, feeling different or disconnected from everyone else. It's like those experiences create this invisible barrier that makes it hard to connect with people on a deeper level.
And that isolation can be made worse by feelings of shame, guilt, or self-blame, which are common after trauma.
Right.
It's like we take those experiences to heart and start to believe that we're somehow messed up or not worthy of love and connection.
It's like we've built these walls around ourselves to protect ourselves from more pain, but they also stop us from experiencing the joy and fulfillment of real connection.
And that's where vulnerability is so important.
Yeah.
It's about being brave enough to let those walls down, to be our true selves, and to let ourselves be seen and loved for who we really are.
It's about realizing that those experiences, those wounds, don't make us unworthy or unlovable.
Right.
In fact, they often make us more compassionate, more understanding, and more capable of deep connection.
And that brings us back to how important it is to find those safe spaces.
Yeah.
Where we can be vulnerable, where we can share our stories, and where we can connect with people who get what we've been through.
It's about recognizing that we're not alone.
Right.
That there are other people who have been on similar journeys, and that by sharing our stories and supporting each other, we can find healing and strength.
It's about creating a community of healing, a place where being vulnerable is celebrated, where imperfections are okay, and where we can all feel a sense of belonging and connection.
And speaking of connection, I want to talk about one specific consequence of trauma that Doc Snipes brought up: boundary disruption. He talked about how childhood trauma can affect our ability to set and maintain healthy boundaries, which can lead to either super rigid or super loose boundaries.
That makes sense. A kid's sense of safety and security depends so much on their caregivers.
Right.
So if those caregivers were intrusive, dismissive, or inconsistent in their responses, it can create confusion and insecurity about where those boundaries are.
It's like you never learned how to say no or to stand up for what you need and want.
Right.
Or on the other hand, you might have built up these walls to protect yourself, making it hard to let anyone in.
And those patterns can continue into adulthood, affecting our relationships, our work, even our sense of self.
Right.
We might find ourselves always giving too much, taking on too much responsibility, or sacrificing our own needs to please others. Or we might isolate ourselves, avoid intimacy, and have a hard time trusting anyone.
It's like those early experiences created a blueprint for how we relate to others. A blueprint that might have been necessary for survival back then, but isn't working for us anymore.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing those patterns, those boundary problems, and consciously choosing to create new, healthier ways of relating to ourselves and others.
Doc Snipes suggests being mindful of our boundaries. You know, paying attention to our thoughts, feelings, and needs.
Right.
And then learning how to be assertive so we can communicate and maintain those boundaries.
It's about recognizing that we have a right to our own space, our own time, our own energy.
Yeah.
And it's about respecting those boundaries in other people, too. It's a two-way street, and it's crucial for healthy relationships and feeling good overall.
And, you know, setting boundaries can be extra hard for people who've been through trauma.
Right.
Because those early experiences might have taught them that their needs aren't important or that standing up for themselves will make people reject or abandon them.
It's like those old fears and insecurities come back, making it hard to stand up for yourself or to say no when you need to. But the truth is, setting boundaries is an act of self-love. It's about honoring your needs, protecting your energy, and creating space for healthy and fulfilling relationships.
Speaking of healthy relationships, I'm also thinking about those cognitive distortions that Doc Snipes talked about. You know, those negative thought patterns that can twist our perception of reality and lead to anxiety, depression, and even self-sabotage.
Yeah, he mentioned a few specific types of cognitive distortions like personalization, overgeneralization, all-or-nothing thinking, and emotion-based reasoning. These distortions are like mental traps that can keep us stuck in negative thinking and stop us from seeing the world clearly.
He compared them to a funhouse mirror.
Oh, yeah.
Explaining how cognitive distortions can warp our view of ourselves and the world, making things seem bigger, smaller, or more messed up than they actually are.
And those distortions can be super powerful.
Yeah.
You know, they can influence our emotions, our behaviors, even our physical health.
Right.
They can lead to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, even self-destructive behaviors.
It's like those early experiences created these lenses through which we see the world, and those lenses are often distorted, making it hard to see things clearly and to react in a balanced and healthy way.
Exactly, and it's about recognizing those distortions, challenging those negative thought patterns, and replacing them with more balanced and realistic thoughts.
And that's where therapy can be so helpful.
Right.
It gives you a safe place to explore those distortions, understand where they come from, and develop strategies to change your thinking.
It's about learning to spot those automatic negative thoughts, to question if they're really true, and to replace them with more balanced and realistic ones.
Right.
It's about challenging those shoulds and musts that trap us in self-criticism and perfectionism.
And it's about realizing that our thoughts aren't facts, they're just thoughts.
Right.
And we get to choose which thoughts we believe, which ones we act on, and which ones we just let go.
It's about taking control of your mind.
Right.
You know, recognizing that you don't have to be a victim of those negative thought patterns.
Yeah.
You have the power to choose different thoughts, to create new stories, and to shape your own reality.
And that's a really empowering message, I think.
It is. It reminds you that we're not helpless.
Yeah.
That we have choices, and that we can create a more positive and fulfilling life for ourselves.
And, you know, while we're talking about empowering ourselves and creating a more positive life, I want to go back to something that several of our sources mentioned, the importance of secure attachment, especially in early childhood.
Yeah, both the Unafraid source and IHDCYH talks emphasize how those early bonds with caregivers can really impact a child's development.
Right.
You know, shaping their sense of self, their ability to build relationships, and even their resilience when faced with tough times.
It's like those early relationships create the foundation for how we see ourselves in the world around us.
Right. If those relationships were full of love, safety, and responsiveness, we're more likely to develop a secure attachment style, which sets us up for healthy relationships and emotional well-being.
But if those early relationships were full of neglect, abuse, or inconsistency, we're more likely to develop an insecure attachment style, which can lead to problems in relationships, trouble regulating emotions, and even a higher chance of mental health issues.
It's like those early experiences create this internal working model of relationships.
Right.
A set of beliefs and expectations about how relationships work and what we can expect from others.
And those beliefs can be so powerful. You know, they can influence our choices, our behaviors, even our ability to form healthy and satisfying connections.
It's like those early experiences create these templates for how we relate to people.
Right.
And those templates can either support healthy connection or create obstacles to intimacy and trust.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? Maybe it's about becoming aware of their own attachment style, understanding how those early experiences might be shaping their relationships now, and finding the support and resources they need to heal those old wounds and create new, healthier ways of relating to people.
It's about realizing that even though those early experiences were important, they don't have to define us. We have the power to choose differently, to create new relationship patterns, and to build secure and loving connections with others.
And that's such a hopeful message.
Yeah.
It reminds us that we're not doomed to repeat those patterns,
Right.
that we can heal, grow, and create a more fulfilling life for ourselves.
It's about realizing that we deserve love and connection no matter what we've been through. And it's about believing that we have the power to change, to heal those old wounds, and to build relationships that are based on trust, respect, and vulnerability.
And as we're talking about healing those old wounds and creating healthy relationships, I'm also thinking about forgiveness.
Forgiveness is complicated and often really hard, especially when it comes to forgiving those who've hurt us deeply. But it's a crucial part of healing.
Yeah.
It's about letting go of the anger, resentment, and bitterness
Yeah.
that can keep us trapped in the past.
It's not about saying what happened was okay or that the person who hurt us was right. It's about freeing. It sounds like forgiveness is more about letting go of that bitterness for ourselves, not really for the person who hurt us.
Exactly. It's about realizing that you deserve to be free from that burden, that you deserve peace and joy, even if the person who hurt you never takes responsibility.
That's a powerful way to look at it. It's like taking back your power, taking control of your own emotional well-being. But it's not easy, I imagine, especially when you've been really hurt.
Yeah. Forgiveness is definitely a journey, not a quick fix. It's about those baby steps, being kind to yourself and having patience along the way.
Yeah.
It might take therapy, journaling, spiritual stuff, or even just talking to a good friend or a mentor.
And, speaking of forgiveness, I'm also thinking about forgiving ourselves, which is something that comes up a lot when we're talking about healing from trauma.
Right. It's really common for people who've experienced trauma to blame themselves, to feel guilty or ashamed, even if they were just kids when it happened.
It's like we take on those experiences and start believing that it was our fault somehow, that we could have stopped it or that we're messed up or unworthy because of it.
And those beliefs can be so destructive, leading to low self-esteem, self-sabotage, and even trouble forming healthy relationships. It's like we're carrying around this heavy weight of shame and guilt, and it can really stop us from enjoying life.
So how do we even start to forgive ourselves for something that wasn't our fault? It feels impossible, like trying to move a mountain.
Self-forgiveness is a process, and it often starts with realizing that we're doing the best we could with what we had back then.
Yeah.
Having compassion for that younger version of ourselves, that child who was hurting and scared and trying to figure out a world that felt chaotic and unsafe.
It's about recognizing that we're not defined by our past, by the mistakes we made or the choices we wish we could change. It's about accepting our imperfections, our humanness, and realizing that we're all still growing and learning.
Yeah, that's a message we all need to hear. It reminds us that we're all worthy of love and compassion no matter what we've been through.
Something Martha Londigan said in her TED Talk really stuck with me. She talked about the difference between living in spite of your past and actually integrating those experiences into your present.
Yeah, that's such an important distinction.
Yeah.
Living in spite of something means you're constantly fighting against it, trying to run from it or pretend it didn't happen. But integration, it's more about taking a whole person approach.
Right.
You acknowledge those experiences, understand their impact, and let them shape who you are without controlling you.
It's like those experiences become part of your story, but they don't write the whole thing.
Exactly.
You can see the pain, the challenges, the losses, but you can also see the strength, the resilience, the lessons learned, and the growth that came out of it all.
And that's where the idea of post-traumatic growth really shines. It's about understanding that even though trauma can leave deep wounds, it can also be a catalyst for huge personal transformation. It can lead to more empathy, a deeper appreciation for life, a stronger sense of purpose, and even a more authentic and meaningful connection with others.
Londigan's story is a perfect example of that. She didn't hide the dark parts of her past, but she didn't let them define her either. She used those experiences to fuel her passion for helping others to connect with people who've been through similar things and to build a life full of meaning and purpose.
It's about understanding that our wounds can become our strengths.
Right.
That our pain can become our purpose. and that our stories have the power to inspire, to heal, and to create positive change in the world.
And as we're talking about her story and the power of sharing our stories, I'm also thinking about how important it is to find our voice, especially for people who've been through trauma.
Yeah, it's like those experiences can shut us down, make us feel ashamed or scared to speak up,
Yeah.
to share our truth.
It's like trauma takes away our voice and leaves us feeling powerless, silent, and invisible. It's like those experiences create this sense of shame that makes it so hard to talk about what happened, even with people we love and trust.
But finding our voice,
Yeah.
taking back that power to tell our own stories can be such a powerful part of healing.
Absolutely. It's about breaking the silence, stepping out of the shadows, and owning what happened to us.
Right.
It's about understanding that our stories matter, that they can connect us with other people, inspire hope, and create change.
It's like you're taking back your power, reclaiming your story, and saying, this is what happened to me, and I'm not going to be quiet about it anymore.
And finding your voice doesn't have to mean shouting it from the rooftops.
Right.
It might be a quiet whisper, something you share with a close friend, a journal entry, a piece of art, or even just silently acknowledging your truth to yourself.
It's about finding what feels right for now.
Yeah.
The way that honors your experiences and lets you express yourself authentically. And it's about understanding that sharing your story in whatever way feels safe and empowering can help you heal, and it can help others heal too.
And that brings us back to what this deep dive has been all about. We've explored the science, the statistics, the personal stories, and the complicated nature of childhood trauma.
Yeah, we've looked at its impact on the brain, the body behavior, and relationships.
And what we've seen is a mix of darkness and light of pain and resilience of brokenness and healing. It reminds us that even though trauma is a big problem and it can be really painful, it's not the end of the story.
We can choose how we react to those experiences. We can seek support, build resilience, and create new stories that honor our past without letting it control us.
And for everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights, some new ways of looking at things, and maybe even a little bit of hope.
As we wrap things up here, I want to leave you with one last question to think about. It's inspired by Martha Lundagen's story. What if, instead of seeing your past as something you have to get over, you saw it as a way to connect with and help others who've gone through something similar? How would that change how you see things? How would that change your story?